Record. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Elias Kriependruck, and I am the founder of the Kriependruck Stock Market News. The Kriependruck Stock Market News, it is basically a podcast in which I summarize and explain every trading day. And you can listen to the podcast on all platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now this YouTube channel I created in addition to my podcast. And what I do here is I upload a question of the day every weekday that is highly relevant to markets at the moment. And I just explain to you that question. So today I prepared a very special question, a question that I am also myself very, very passionate about. And I also drew a little explanation here on the board. Well, today's question of the day is, are the markets pricing in an unrealistic scenario? Now, let me break down this question very quickly. Now, what are markets pricing in at the moment? You have probably seen the outperformance or the very good performance of U.S. stocks in the past weeks, and you maybe have wondered why. Because we still have very high inflation. The Federal Reserve is hiking interest rates. What markets are pricing in at the moment is a immaculate disinflation scenario. Now, what does immaculate disinflation mean? Immaculate disinflation means that you have a strong economy in the form of a very resilient labor market, for example, and at the same time, you have disinflation, right? So you're seeing inflation come down. At the same time, you have a very strong economy. And the fact that we are seeing inflation come down will allow the Federal Reserve to cut rates while we are still having a strong economy. Now, why is this scenario, why does it seem unrealistic to me? Well, the fact that you let inflation run out of control, if you just go back to the 1970s, there seems to be this trade-off between once you let inflation run out of control, you need, in order for it to fall back to the 2% target, to the target of the Federal Reserve, you need to see some economic weakness. So there's this idea among economists that in order to get inflation to the 2% target, the unemployment rate needs to rise, for example. You need to get wage inflation down. The consumer needs to lose some of his or her resilience. And once we see that weakening of the economy and hence also disinflation, the central banks will be able to cut rates. Now, you probably realize that this combination of a strong economy and at the same time disinflation is a little bit unrealistic. Now, in order to give you a better idea of what I mean, there are basically two types of opinions out there. Two types of opinions from economists, from analysts. I'm not going to go into who says what because there are many names, but I will of course give you an example of the types. Now, over here on the left, it says type 1. That is the first type of analysts and economists. They believe that we will not see a strong economy, so they disagree with this part of what markets are pricing in at the moment. They believe we will not see a strong economy, but they do believe that we will see rate cuts. So the fact that markets are pricing in rate cuts is realistic to these analysts, but the fact that we will see a resilient economy is unrealistic. So there's already some mispricing there. An example of who believes that this, who is part of this type 1 analyst is, for example, UBS, a very renowned UBS analyst. I forgot her name at the moment, but she was on Bloomberg Markets to Close yesterday on an interview, and she said that we will see economic weakness to such an extent that the Fed will cut rates this year. And that economic weakness will cause the markets to price in even more rate cuts. But overall, she says no to this notion here, to this notion that we will have a strong economy in 2023. So the markets, in her eyes, are pricing in an unrealistic scenario, not in terms of rate cuts, not in terms of disinflation, but in terms of a strong economy. Now, there's a second type of analysts and economists out there. For example, the very, very renowned Mohamed El-Erian from, he's the president of Queen's College. He says yes, basically, to a strong economy, but he says no to rate cuts. I will give you an example. When the most recent labor market report was released, Mohamed El-Erian was on Bloomberg, and he said that after the numbers were released, he said that this jobs report shows that markets should be more worried about interest rate hikes than about potential weaknesses in the economy, potential credit risks. He explicitly mentioned credit risks in this point. In this interview. So there's this type 2 of economists out there who believe that we will have a strong economy, but no rate cuts. Now, those are the two main opinions out there, right? What do you realize when you look at both of them? It is very interesting. You realize that whoever you ask, if it's either a type 1 or a type 2 analyst, whoever you ask the question, are markets pricing in an unrealistic scenario? Is this immaculate disinflation an unrealistic scenario? Most of the people, the two types of analysts out there, the two strongest opinions, they believe that markets are pricing in an unrealistic scenario, but they still have two different opinions. Now, what does this tell you about the scenario that is being priced in? It tells you that it is very unrealistic, right? These two types of opinions, they show you beautifully that we will get rate cuts if we see weakness in the economy, meaning that we will see inflation fall if we see weakness in the economy, and that will allow the Fed to cut rates. So, like I said, no to strong economy, yes to disinflation, yes to rate cuts. The second type, saying yes to a strong economy, if you take the trade-off into account, the second type believes that we will have a strong economy, but we will not have disinflation to an extent that the Federal Reserve will actually be able to cut rates. So what we can conclude is the trade-off that needs to happen for inflation to fall back to 2% target. And I talked about this in Friday's presentation. I explained why I do not believe that the Fed will cut rates this year. So that there is this trade-off. And I am also of the very strong opinion that in order to get inflation back to the 2% target, the economy needs to lose some resilience. So I'm quickly going to touch upon what I said in the previous presentation on Friday, because it of course suits this topic very well. Now, I believe that we live in a world of deficient aggregate supply. When the supply chain issues began, 2021 going into 2022, they're still out there, of course, these supply chain issues because of political instability, generally geopolitical issues. We have seen a lot of disruption to supply chains, but most of the companies are suffering under them. Now, what does this mean? The fact that all companies are suffering, or most of the large companies are suffering under supply chain issues, that allows them to raise their prices. And the phenomenon we have seen in the past years and that we're still seeing right now, we'll give you an example in a second. The phenomenon we're seeing is that companies are actually, when they all suffer under supply chain issues, they're able to raise their prices by a higher amount compared to how much their production costs actually increase. So essentially, their margins increase. And this rise in margins that we have seen has put a lot of inflationary pressure on the economy. Now you need to ask yourself the question, why are companies able to pass these prices on to consumers? That is essentially where it all comes down to. These companies are able to pass on these higher prices because coming out of the pandemic, a lot of liquidity was pumped into the markets. Consumers came out of the pandemic with record savings. They were in a very strong position financially. So companies were actually able to pass on their prices to consumers. And we have seen in the recent earnings report from Procter & Gamble that companies are still able to pass on these higher prices to consumers. If you look at the numbers of Procter & Gamble, I believe Sales volume fell by 3% because they have been raising their prices, but sales revenue grew by 4%. Now that tells you the fact that they're increasing their prices. Of course, some consumers do not buy their products anymore. That is just 3% decrease in sales revenue. But on the other hand, you still have consumers that are spending. And at the end of the day, their sales revenue rose. So their margins increased essentially here. So what needs to happen is, if companies can continue to pass on these higher prices to consumers, then we will always have these inflationary pressures. So what needs to happen is, even though this sounds very harsh, the consumer needs to lose resilience to such an extent that the companies will not be able to pass on these higher prices. And that, of course, will in turn have disinflationary pressures on the economy, and it will allow the Federal Reserve to restore price stability by bringing inflation back to the 2% target. Now, what needs to happen? This is all connected, and it's very interesting. What needs to happen in order for the consumer to lose resilience? We need to see some weakening in the labor market, meaning that the unemployment rate needs to rise. Larry Summers from Harvard, also he used to be the Treasury Secretary of the US. He believes that in order to get inflation back to 2%, we need to see wage inflation come down. And in order for wage inflation to come down, we need to see slack in the labor market, meaning that we have to see the unemployment rate rise. And in order for the unemployment rate to rise, the Federal Reserve needs to stay hawkish until the economy is at a point where it is not so resilient anymore, right? So that is this Phillips trade-off right here. You need to see the unemployment rate rise in order for inflation to fall back to the 2% target. And once the unemployment rate actually clearly starts to rise, once the labor market starts to show that it is indeed cooling down, the Federal Reserve can cut rates. And that is exactly why this immaculate disinflation, this Goldilocks scenario that is being priced in by markets, is unrealistic. Because both of these are very, very unlikely to happen, as we can also see by our two types of analysts and economists out there. Both of them are very unlikely, especially if you take into account that the Fed, that markets are already pricing in rate cuts by the Fed this year. So this is certainly very interesting topic, and these videos are supposed to be kept short, so I'm not going to continue talking that much. There was one thing that I believe I forgot to mention. Yeah, but I definitely said the most important things already. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up for today's presentation. I really hope that you enjoyed today's question of the day. And yeah, tomorrow another question of the day will be released on this YouTube channel, on the Kriependruck Stock Market News. And also make sure to tune into our podcast episode tonight, in which we will obviously summarize and explain the entire trading day. Have a great evening.